Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's web seminar, Completing the FAFSA, a how-to for assisting California's current and former foster youth. My name is Jessica Petros, and I'm with John Byrne Advocates for Youth, and thank you for joining us this morning. Before we begin, we just have a few logistics. You should all have received a call-in number as well as an access code, and should all be on mute. If you have any questions that come up during the webinar, you can just submit questions as they come up. Just simply click on the questions panel, type in your question, and click send. The last 15 minutes of today's webinar will be dedicated to questions and answers, so we'll make sure to address any questions you have at that point in time. Also to note, all of today's presentation materials, the PowerPoint slides and audio will be recorded and posted at our website. Simply go to the Research and Training tab and click Training Archive, and you can find it there. So as I mentioned, my name is Jessica Petros. I'm with John Byrne Advocates for Youth. I will also be joined by Juan Hernandez with LA Cash for College, a regional campaign to help students with their financial aid applications. And we'll round out our webinar today with a Q&A discussion featuring Mark Kantrowitz, the publisher and VP of Research with savingforcollege.com. And I just wanted to personally thank Mark and his colleague David Levy with Coastline Community College for their contributions and assistance in creating today's web seminar. So we have a lot to cover, so we'll get started. There are many steps to the financial aid process, from submitting the application to getting your award notification, getting that money, and maintaining the financial aid. For today's webinar, we'll really just be focusing on the first two steps, providing a step-by-step guide on how to fill out the financial aid application, as well as a few tips for students that might get flagged for additional verification. Now, before we dive into the actual application, we wanted to give you a little bit of context to understand the financial aid process and what financial aid is. Financial aid can come from a lot of different sources, from the state, from the federal government, from colleges and universities, or private organizations and companies as well. And there's many different types of aid. One category is gift aid, often considered free aid. One type might be in the form of a fee waiver. So for example, the California College Promise Grant at our community colleges waives the cost of classes for students in the form of a fee waiver. Another common type of gift aid that you're probably more familiar with are grants. This is often considered free money that the students do not have to pay back as long as they do well in their coursework, pass enough classes along the way as well. The other type of gift aid is scholarships, and this is free money generally that students do not have to pay back. Another form of financial aid can be in the form of Workstudy. These are usually part-time jobs. They can be on campus or off campus, and they are offered a certain amount of money, but they do have to work and earn that paycheck in order to receive that type of financial aid. And lastly, the other category are loans, and this is money that students do have to pay back along with interest. Now, there are many different types of financial aid that are need-based. We wanted to make sure that you understand what that means and how need is defined. So each college, they determine what their overall cost of attendance is for a student to attend their college. This can include supplies and things of that nature. Then once the student fills out their financial aid application, it's determined what their expected family contribution is, EFC. And this is a number that says how much they believe the student is able to contribute towards that cost of the attendance. It's usually based on their income, assets, house, school looks at the cost of location to determine eligibility-based aid. There are many different types of need-based aid: Pell grants from the state, Pell grants from the federal government, any loans as well. Now on this slide you can see a long list of different types of financial aid, and we're not all of them today, but I just wanted to give you a so you familiar yourself with the different types that are more common of different federal, the Pell Grant, which can be cash. to go for the student to use at their discretion to cover the cost of attendance. Other types of financial aid might be like the Cal Grant as well. So you can just have this here for your reference to look at later if you want to familiarize yourself with the different types of financial aid coming from the state, federal government. We're also excited to share that there are been many positive policy wins for fostering. The expansion of grants might be that were eligible foster youth up until their 22nd birthday. Eligible foster youth can now receive it up until their 26th birthday as of July 1st of the award year. And this is money that can be up to $5,000 for eligible foster youth to use at two-year universities, full education programs, both in the state and out of state. Students now also receive this money for up to 5 years. That can either be consecutive 5 years or not. And for any of you that have worked with any students that previously received the Chafee grant, they stopped receiving it due to changing the fold back into the website there to learn more about the Chafee grant. The other exciting win for our foster youth this year was there's also an expansion to Cal Grant entitlement eligibility as well. So previously and currently for students in general, to be able to get the Cal Grant entitlement, students have to apply within 1 year after high school. But now for our eligible foster youth, they can actually apply up until the age of 26. The other thing this expansion does is currently students can only receive this Cal Grant for up to 4 years. However, for eligible foster youth, they can now receive this Cal Grant up to 8 years. And lastly, students who are attending a community previously their application by March 2nd college can submit their application. Planning on attending a 4-year though, like a CSU or a UC, they do still need to get in their application by March 2nd. I just wanted to note as well that while there's not a separate application for the Cal Grant, it is critical that students make sure that their high schools submit their GPA. Most high schools do these things automatically, but it's important and it's the student's responsibility to check with their high school to make sure that their GPA was submitted so it can be matched with the student so they can qualify for this financial aid. And how foster youth is defined for the Cal Grant is any foster youth that was in care on or after their 13th birthday. So now that we've given a little bit of information about the financial aid process, some updates for our foster youth, how do you actually apply for financial aid? So there are 2 types of applications. The first one that many of you are familiar with is the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. This is for students who are U.S. citizens, a permanent resident, or an other eligible non-citizen. For example, someone with a green card. And they can fill out the application on the website listed there. The other application is for students that are undocumented, and they can fill out the California DREAM Act application. And the website for that application is also listed there. I do want to know these applications are available on what students can. Now, for students who are filling out the California DREAM Act application, I do want to note that I'll qualify for federal financial aid, such as the financial aid to the state of California. And also to note, for many students right now, it can be a scary and a difficult time, and they might be fearful about self-identifying if they are undocumented. But just to remind students that the data that they provide is completely confidential. It's not shared with the federal government or any immigration enforcement. Also, it is not related to DACA. That is a separate program through the federal government. A student does not have to have DACA to be able to apply for the California DREAM Act application. And also, if you are working with any students that have received a temporary Social Security number through DACA, they still do need to apply through the California DREAM Act application. And if you're interested in learning more about the eligibility criteria, again, you can go to the website listed on the prior page. Another note, if you are working with any students that are undocumented, is about special immigration juvenile status. This is a law that allows undocumented children who are still in care to apply to become a lawful permanent resident. So just to note, if you are working with any undocumented students that are still minors, have them talk to their child welfare agency to see if this is the right option for them. And if you are working with any students that did apply for special immigrant juvenile status, the application could take several years to get processed, and even if they have applied, they still have to fill out the California DREAM Act application until their application is processed. Another new update this year, in addition to the options to fill out the applications online, students can now fill out their FAFSA via their mobile phone through this new FAFSA app. So this is brand new this year, and you want to let students know about this option as well. All right, so when should students apply? There's a priority application period for the FAFSA and the California DREAM Act application. That period is October 1st through March 2nd. And this is for the application before the start of the year that they'll begin college. So for example, if you're working with students who are interested in starting school in the fall of 2019, they'd be filling out that application right now. This is the priority period, so students can apply after March 2nd, but they may receive less money. So we really want to encourage them to apply early to get all the financial aid award possible. Some colleges might have earlier priority deadlines, so definitely have the student check with that college to see if there's any earlier priority application deadlines as well. And students can actually fill out this application even before they've completed their college admissions application. So maybe they're not sure yet where they want to apply. That's okay. They can still fill out the financial aid application. Now, if you're working with these students, you want to make sure that they're prepared to come and fill out the application and have what they need. So there's a few things that they should bring. One is they should bring their Social Security number or their alien registration number. It's really important that students know what their number is and what their name is on their Social Security card so that it matches in the system. We don't want them to use any nicknames or anything like that. So it should match exactly as it appears on their Social Security card. Students will also need an email address, and many of our high school seniors in particular may not have an email address, or they might have one issued by their high school, which can often be temporary. So it's important to make sure that students set up an email address that they can use long-term throughout their time in college. Next, they need to bring a list of which colleges they're interested in applying to. They need at minimum one college, but they can actually list up to 10 colleges. So you want them to start thinking about where they're interested in applying. And lastly, they need to bring their tax or income information from the prior year. So currently, for example, if you're working with students who are applying to college to begin in fall of 2019, they'll be asked about their financial information from 2017. So what we have in front of you here is the first screen of the FAFSA application. I just wanted to note that the federal government actually has a new layout now for the FAFSA application, so it looks a little bit differently than years past. Some of the wording on the questions has also changed in a way that I think is actually easier for students to understand. And as we go through the FAFSA application, I did want to note that most of the questions on the FAFSA mirror the questions on the California DREAM Act application. So if you're working with any undocumented students, this information will also be helpful to you as well. So to fill the application, students go to this website and they click Start Here. Just to note, the FAFSA does need to be completed every year. And if you're working with any students that have filled it out in the past, they can actually log in as a returning user, and some of their information from last year will be pre-filled into the FAFSA. So once they click Start, the first step in the process is to create a FSA ID, a Federal Student Aid Identification. So this is what the login page will look like. The student will need to click the button that says, I am the student, and then click the button that says Create One. This FSA ID is going to serve as their legal signature, so they're going to need it to sign the FAFSA electronically at the end before they can submit it. And I will note that in my experience working with students and filling out the FAFSA, the FSA ID can sometimes be the longest and most complicated of the students, so this is where they might need your support. So once they get into FSA ID, they'll actually be taken to a separate website, and this is what it looks like. They'll be asked a series of questions, asking them to enter an email address, a username, and a password, and social security number, and again, making sure that students take the time information carefully and accurately. If you're working with the student, the number, they can contact their child welfare department. And I recommend to students that they actually get that physical card because they're going to need it for the future as well. Next, they'll have to enter a mailing address. And it is optional, but they can also enter a mobile phone. This is just to help them with recovery. If they get locked out of the application, it can help them get back in, but it is optional. Then next here, they'll have to answer a series of challenge questions. This sometimes can be challenging for some students. Maybe it's asking personal information that they may not know the information to or may not feel comfortable answering. So they might need some support in figuring out the challenge questions and the answers that are appropriate for them. Next, they're almost done. They just read the terms and conditions, click the button that they certify, and click Continue. And their FSA ID is complete. Now, as you will have noticed, there were a lot of different things that students had to create in this process: an FSA ID username, a password. For many students, they may have had to create an email address with its own separate password, as well as challenge questions and answers. We really recommend that students write these items somewhere down safe so that they don't forget, maybe take a photo of them, whatever works best for that student. But we want to make sure that they have this information for the future so they can reference it. So now that they've created their FSA ID, they're ready to begin the FAFSA application. They're going to go back into this login page and put in their FSA ID username and password and click Next. There'll be a quick disclaimer. They just need to click Accept to move along. And then they need to select which academic year they're applying for. So again, if they're starting in the fall, they'll be clicking the 2019-2020 FAFSA. And just remember that the school year begins in the fall term. So if you have a student that's applying for a summer session, that's usually part of the prior academic year. So next here, they have to create yet another password, create a save key. This is in case they don't fill out their application all in one sitting and they want to finish it later. They can log back in within 45 days to complete and submit the FAFSA. So they need to create the save key. And just like with all the other different items that they created, we want to make sure to add the save key information to their list as well so that they have this safe and stored. Next, there's just a brief introduction page with general information if they're interested in reading about that. If not, they can just click Next. And then they're going to come to this screenshot. As you can see on the top of the screen, there's 7 sections to fill out the FAFSA, starting with student demographics, school selection, all the way to confirmation. We're going to walk through each section in depth with you all today so you know how to answer every question. You'll notice as well that there's a button at the top called Save, so students can save their information as they move along. And if they have any questions, you'll also notice this blue question mark icon that they can go to if they need any further information for each question. So we'll start with the first section, student demographics section. There are 2 parts, student demographics information and then student eligibility. So starting with the student demographic section, starts off simple with their name, social security number, and date of birth. Again, making sure the students enter this information accurately is really critical to make sure that they get their financial aid. Next, they're going to enter a permanent mailing address. Now, if you're working with a student that doesn't have a permanent mailing address, they can always check in with their college's financial aid department to get assistance with this. This could also be a PO box as well if they don't have a permanent mailing address. And they'll also need to enter their email address. Again, the email is going to be very critical. Students are going to get a lot of follow-up information via email, and we want to make sure that they're checking that email regularly to get all this critical information so they don't miss out on any financial aid. The next question is about student residency. You'll see this info box that pops up, ask them about state application. So what they're referring here to is eligibility for the Cal Grant. As I mentioned before, there's actually not a separate application that students will have to fill out for the Cal Grant application, but it's going to ask them if they've lived in California for at least 5 years. I would like to note, though, in California, though, that they only require students to be a state resident for at least 1 year. And while there's not a separate Cal Grant application, again, as we noted before, we still need to make sure that students' high schools submit their GPA verification so it can get matched with their application to receive that type of financial aid. So the next panel is going to ask them if they're a male or a female. Just to note, the federal government defines this as being based on their sex at birth, as indicated on their birth certificate. They can enter a driver's license if they have one, but it's not required and it doesn't affect their eligibility. And they can also enter a telephone number, but again, it's not required to complete the FAFSA. The next section is going to ask them about their student marital status. You might want to clarify what this means for students. If they have a boyfriend or girlfriend, they're still considered single. It's really asking if they're legally married to answer yes for this question. The next section is asking if they're a U.S. citizen. Now, there's actually 3 options. One is yes, I am a U.S. citizen. No, but I'm an eligible non-citizen. And this is where they would enter their alien registration number. And the third option is no, I am not a citizen or eligible non-citizen. And of course, if that's the option for that student, they would need to see if they're eligible to fill out the California DREAM Act application instead. Now, if on the prior slide, the student identified as being a male, they're going to be asked if they're registered with the Selective Service System. This is actually a requirement from the federal government that in order to receive federal student aid, they need to be registered with the Selective Service System. If they have not yet done that, the FAFSA application makes it very easy for students, and they can simply just click yes and be automatically enrolled and registered with the Selective Service System. In the next section, it's going to ask them what their high school completion status will be. Perhaps they are going to be receiving their high school diploma or their GED. Then it's going to ask them what will their college grade level be when they begin the 2019-2020 school year. Now, many of you might be working with high school students who are actually duly enrolled and taking college classes, maybe at their local community college. If you are working with students that are in that scenario, they're still considered a first-time college student, and they can select the option that says never attended college / first year. The next question is asking them what degree or certificate they'll be working on when they begin the 2019-2020 school year. Now, you might be working with a student who says, I don't know what I want to do. We really advise that they don't select other or undecided, that they do pick an educational path. We don't want them to be limited by the grants that they can receive. And if they're not sure yet, if they're wanting to do a 2-year or a 4-year, we would recommend that they just select 4-year college. The next question is asking if they're interested in being considered for work study. In my experience, a lot of students may not know what work study is, so you might want to educate them about what this means. And if they click the button and say yes, that they are interested, it's not going to automatically guarantee that they get that work study. And also, if they are offered work study, they can always decline it later if they change their mind and decide that that's not the right fit for them. Now, the next question is a really important question for our foster youth. It's asking, are you a foster youth or were you at any time in the foster care system? This could even be for foster youth who were in the foster care system for just one day. Now, we want to encourage students to click yes here. It doesn't automatically enroll them into any programs or services, but for many colleges, this is how they find out who their foster youth students are, and this allows them to reach out to these students and get them connected to resources and support. So we definitely encourage that they answer yes here. The next question is asking about highest school completed by parent 1 or parent 2. For many of our foster youth, they may not know that question or may not want to answer that question, and that is completely fine. Foster youth can definitely just select other or unknown, and it won't affect any of their eligibility for federal student aid. The next question is asking if they've ever received federal student aid. If yes, they're going to be asked if they've ever been convicted for the possession or sale of illegal drugs for an offense that occurred while receiving federal student aid. The rules of the federal government is that if you receive federal student aid, you can't be convicted for the possession or sale of illegal drugs while receiving that federal aid. So if the answer is yes, they'll have to fill out a worksheet to determine if they're still eligible to continue to receive federal student aid. And if it is suspended, there are a few options for students that they can complete an approved drug rehabilitation program or pass to unannounced drug tests to be able to continue to receive that federal student aid in the future. The next section in the application is the school selection section. So what we have here, if in the prior slide your student indicated that they're going to be completing their high school diploma, they're going to ask them to enter the name of that high school. Now they can enter in that name or they can search to find their high school. We definitely recommend that they search to find their high school so that there aren't any spelling errors in how they enter their high school. It's going to be really critical that they enter the correct information about their high school to make sure that their GPA that the high school submits on their behalf is correctly matched to the student when they submit their FAFSA application. So again, we encourage them to use that search function. Now, if on the prior slide they said that they'll be receiving a GED or a state authorized high school equivalent certificate, they won't have to provide any additional information. So once they've entered their high school information, they're going to be asked to select which colleges they want to attend. So as I mentioned before, they can search for and select up to 10 colleges that they're interested in, and the information from this FAFSA will be sent to the schools that have been selected. If things change, that's definitely fine. Once their application is processed, they can go back in and make any updates or changes to their school selection if their plans change along the way. And just as a tip, maybe you have a student that actually wants to apply to more than 10 colleges, and that's fine too. What they would do is fill out the application, identify up to 10 colleges that they want to attend to, and then once their FAFSA has been processed and they've received their student aid report, their STAR, then they can actually go back into the application and replace the original set of 10 colleges with a new set of up to 10 colleges and repeat this process as many times as they would like. So to select their school, it's pretty simple. They can search by federal school code if they happen to know that. Otherwise, they can search the state and the city to find the school that they're looking for. Once they put in that information, it'll populate a list, as you can see here as an example, and they just select the school that they're interested in. I would make sure that students are educated to really understand the different types of college pathways, from private trade schools that can be more costly to community colleges or four-year universities, to make sure that they're really selecting the best option that's in line with their goals as well. And if they're applying to a UC or a CSU campus, they do need to fill out and identify each UC and each CSU that they're interested in applying to. Once they've identified their schools, it will generate a list of the schools that they've selected, and then they'll need to indicate what their housing plans are. So they can either select on campus, off campus, or with parents. Now, if you're working with any foster youth that are planning to live with a foster parent, a relative caregiver, or even a legal guardian, we really encourage that they actually select off campus so they can get more money. And if they're planning on attending a college that does offer on-campus housing, such as dorms, typically at our four-year universities, we'd also encourage that they just go ahead and select their plans to live on campus to potentially be offered more financial aid. And I would also like to note the order in which they list these colleges in California doesn't make a difference. So now that we've gotten through these first two sections, I'm going to hand it over to Juana Hernandez to walk us through the rest of the FAFSA application.
Thanks so much, Jessica. So again, my name is Juana Hernandez, and I'm with LA Cash for College. At the end of our presentation, you will also get some information about additional resources for financial aid assistance, including how to locate a Cash for College workshop near you. But let's dive in with the dependency status section, which in my opinion is one of the most important sections for our foster youth to complete and to do so accurately. So if we can go, Jessica, to the next slide. So what the dependency section is, so as you can see on your screen, this is the third section of the FAFSA application that follows the school selection. The dependency section will determine if the student will be considered a dependent student who has to report parental information, or if they will be considered an independent student for the purposes of the FAFSA. Now, I do want to note that when we're talking about parent for FAFSA, we are referring exclusively to biological parents. If a student is determined to be an independent student based off of their answers to these questions, they will not have to supply any information for their biological parents, nor will they have to submit any information for adoptive or foster parents, whether they are living with a relative or non-relative caregiver or a legal guardian. Next slide. So the dependency questions will appear one at a time, and if a student can answer yes to any of them, that is what's going to determine their independent status. So I do want to note that in some cases, students might be determined to be independent because of their age or other factors, such as if they have their own dependent children. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, for our foster youth, there are two important questions that they can actually respond to. And again, these will come up one at a time. So the first question you'll see here on your screen reads, at any time since you turned age 13, were both your parents deceased, were you in foster care, or were you a dependent or ward of the court? There is also another question here highlighted in the orange box that reads, does someone other than your parents or step-parent have legal guardianship over you as determined by a court in your state of legal residence? So if our foster youth can answer yes to either or both of these questions, we want to make sure that they go ahead and check that box. Importantly, if a foster youth is unsure if they were in foster care based off of this definition, you can clarify that there should be court-ordered documents that would have determined that they were a ward of the court. Now, the length of time in foster care does matter to some extent. So a foster youth should have been in foster care any time after turning age 13. So if they exited care before the age 13 and were reunited with their parents, they would be unable to check that box. Now, if they were in foster care for only one day and there was a court-ordered document showing that they were a ward of the court for one day on or after the age of 13, they would be eligible to check this box. And if a student feels like this definition doesn't quite apply to them, but they want to seek an exemption, they can go ahead and consult with the financial aid officer at the college that they intend to enroll at to get more guidance on how they might be able to qualify as a foster youth. Next slide. So again, here we have, again, some of the same language that was already referenced on the left-hand side of the screen. but I want to point your attention to the green box. So if a foster youth is indicating on their FAFSA by checking either of those two questions that they are a foster youth, their college may actually follow up with them and require that they submit documentation to verify that they were in fact a foster youth and that they can receive that independent student status. So those who are currently in foster care should contact their social worker or their ILP program coordinator in order to receive their court dependency letter. Similarly, for those who are former foster youth, they can connect with their child welfare agency, and if they have any difficulty reaching someone at their local child welfare agency, they can simply contact the State Foster Care Ombudsman Office, and that 877 phone number is listed here. We really want to emphasize that foster youth should keep a copy of this dependency letter for their records, keep it with their social security card and other vital documents, as they might end up needing to submit this documentation for other purposes, or perhaps if they were to transfer or go to another college. Next slide. Now, I do want to highlight, I know Jessica started us off with pointing out some big policy changes that happen in the state of California and how they affect foster youth eligibility for financial aid. There is one other big policy change that we want to alert you to as it relates to foster youth verification. So last year, California passed Senate Bill 12, which establishes an automated verification for foster youth. And this bill, which passed in 2017, did take effect as law January 1st, 2018. However, the California Department of Social Services and the California Student Aid Commission had to actually figure out this process on how to perform this data match between their two databases in order to automatically screen and verify foster care status. And while the target date for the system was to be up July 1st of this year, my understanding is that that process is still being finalized. So we are hoping to very soon see that foster youth will be automatically screened between these two state departments so that they will no longer have to request the dependency letter and submit it to their college for verification. But until we hear about that change, just be sure you ask your students to get that dependency letter and keep it for their records. This is something that might change in the middle of the current FAFSA season, and certainly we hope by the next filing period. Next slide. So going back to our FAFSA slides, once a student has already responded to their questions about their foster care status, they will be asked to supply their household size. Now, if the student previously indicated that they were married, they will automatically see a number pop up here for themselves and for their spouse. And if they previously indicated that they have any children, they should be entering the number of children here into their household size. Now, for a foster youth who might be living with a foster family, with a caregiver, a group home, siblings, or other relatives, they should not be including any of those individuals into their household size. So for example, a foster youth living in a group home would enter 1 for themselves. If they do not have a spouse or a child, that number will stay 1, and they will not factor in any of the individuals living in the group home. So in that scenario, the foster youth household size will be 1. They will next have to enter the number of individuals in the household who will be enrolled in college. So all of our students here will be entering 1 for themselves. And if they have a spouse who is also going to be enrolled in college at least half-time, then they might increase that number to 2. Next slide. So if a student does, again, meet that status, that criteria to be independent student status, they will not need to supply information about parents. They will, however, see this question pop up asking if they want to elect to submit information about their parents, and they can go ahead and select no. By checking no, it does not in any way negatively impact their eligibility for financial aid. So you can go ahead and assure students that selecting no won't end up hurting their chances for receiving financial aid. Next slide. So parent demographics section, we can just move through this slide. Again, if a student was listed as independent on the previous dependency section, they will not have to complete this section, and they will actually be able to bypass this section automatically. Now, I did reference earlier that if a foster youth was in care early on and they exited care before turning age 13 and they were, let's say, reunited with their parents, a foster youth in that scenario may actually have to complete this section. For the purposes of today's webinar, we're going to assume that the foster youth you're working with actually is an independent student. They did meet that criteria and they will be skipping this section. So let's go to the next slide. So again, operating under the assumption that we're working with an independent status foster youth, they will not only not have to enter parent demographics, but they will not have to enter any parent financial information, which I know can be a big relief for a lot of our youth. The financial information section that they will have to complete will be relatively simple because it will only be about their personal financial information. We're going to walk through 3 different options. So what to do if your student has already completed their IRS income tax return for the prior year, what to do if the student did not file and they are not going to file that tax return, and then the third scenario, what to do if the student still needs to, they will file that IRS income tax return. Next slide. So first, I want to again clarify what is the prior year. So I know Jessica did reference that if a student were to be beginning college in the 2019-2020 academic year, they would be sitting down today in 2018, the prior year, to complete the FAFSA, and the financial information that they would be supplying are from the prior year, 2017. So again, the student will be asked on this slide to select from the drop-down menu whether they already completed, they will file, or not going to file for the year 2017. Next slide. So let's just look a little bit closely at option A, which is already completed, and this is for a student who was working in 2017 and who already filed taxes for the 2017 year. Next slide. So in this slide, you can see that students now have an option to automatically pull their tax data from the IRS, and this is through the data retrieval tool, the DRT. We want to really emphasize that a student who has already filed and who has this option to pull their data automatically from the IRS should strongly consider using this option. This will simply improve the ease and accuracy of the information that is entered into the FAFSA and can minimize the need for them to go back and have to do corrections later. I do want to point out a few quick things about the IRS data retrieval tool. So first, when the students will go in and use this tool, they won't actually be able to see any of the tax information, and this is really intended to protect the privacy and the security of that tax information. Another thing that a student should note is if they don't have the tax record immediately on hand and they do not want to use the IRS data retrieval tool, they can request a copy of their tax return or transcript for free via the IRS website, which is listed here on your screen. In order to request this transcript, they do need to submit an IRS form 4506T. Now, this form does not have a fee for processing, so if a student does see a note saying that they need to pay a $50 processing fee, that means that they have downloaded the incorrect form. So there is a different form with a very similar name, the form 4506, that does have a fee. So just make sure your students are selecting the form that has a T and that does not have a fee associated with it. Next slide. So when a student does opt to automatically retrieve their data from the IRS using the DRT, the data retrieval tool, they will see this screen appear on their FAFSA. So this is just warning the student that they are going to be leaving the FAFSA on the web and going to the IRS website to retrieve their data. So they will be given the option to select the blue button, proceed to the IRS website, or if they change their mind, they can go ahead and select skip IRS transfer. Again, we strongly encourage the students who have the option to do the data retrieval tool in order to minimize errors. Next slide. Once the student goes to the IRS Web Portal, they will see this message pop up in a pop-out box. And this is simply a warning message alerting them that they are now in the IRS government website. They can just click OK, and that will go ahead and minimize. Next slide. And once that pop-up box is minimized, this is the information that they will see. So you will note the field does have their first and last name, and those are fields that they could actually write in and they can make edits to. The third line there shows their social security number, and you will see that this field is not editable, so the student cannot actually write and change the social security number. And then you will see a few other things such as their tax filing status for that year, so whether they were single or married. Importantly, the student will need to enter their address, and this address must match the address that they used for their tax returns. So again, if they are reporting income information for 2017, this address must match the 2017 address that they use in their tax return. Slide. Verified their address, they will have two buttons on the bottom to choose from, either return to FAFSA or submit, so they can go ahead and click submit. Once they click submit, this is the page that they will see. And again, this page just, again, restates some of this information. It lets them know that the data that they are going to retrieve, they won't actually be able to view. It will be protected for their privacy. They can certainly print this page here for their records if they wish to keep this, but otherwise they can check the first box, transfer my tax information into the FAFSA, and then submit the corresponding button that says transfer now. Again, here the federal government does give the student the option to back out if they get cold feet, and they could do that by selecting the other box, do not transfer my tax information and return to the FAFSA, and selecting the corresponding button, do not transfer. Next slide. So once the student has selected transfer my data, they will be redirected back to the FAFSA website. And you will see here highlighted in the green box on your screen, they will see this message, you have successfully transferred the 2017 tax information or the tax information for whatever year it is that they are submitting. Now you'll also notice in the red box that the questions now have this response already filled out. So when there is a question about their 2017 financial information, it'll say transferred from the IRS, but it will not enable you to view that information. It'll all have the same information in every field. Next slide. So if a student were to not want to use the IRS data retrieval tool, and they have a copy of their tax return handy, or they requested a copy of their tax transcript, they are able to enter that information manually. So we'll go ahead and do a walkthrough of what that process would look like for the student who wants to enter their information manually. So instead of selecting the IRS tool, which again is the option that we recommend, The student who wants to enter their information manually will select the blue link that says "No thanks." Next slide. So from there, the student will be given the option to walk through and manually enter their information. First, the student should know that they will have to report things like their adjusted gross income, how much they earned from working, and then answer a few additional questions about their income. A good thing to know before you begin filling out this information is that each question actually tells you exactly what line of your tax return can you find the answer. So the example here, it'll say, what was your adjusted gross income from 2017? And then it says, this amount is found on IRS Form 1040, line 37. So those are really intended to make sure that the student is pulling the right information from their tax return and trying to minimize the errors. And again, as Jessica noted, if a student does have a question about what this question is really asking, they can click on that arrow blue or the question mark blue icon and get some additional information and clarity about the particular question. Next slide. All right, so if a student had submitted an IRS Form 1040 and their income is below a certain threshold, they may see that the FAFSA will ask them if they are a dislocated worker. Now, there is a link here defining what a dislocated worker is, and again, that question mark blue icon can provide some additional information. If the student were to answer yes, that they were a dislocated worker, their financial aid administrator may require some additional proof that either they or their spouse were a dislocated worker for that tax year. The next section here will ask if anyone in their household received benefits from any of the federal benefit programs listed on the FAFSA. We just want to note that, here in California, we have some different local names for these federal programs, so it's important to be familiar with what those names are. So for example, for Medicaid, the program here locally is known as Medi-Cal. For the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, the program is locally referred to as CalFresh, commonly referred to as food stamps. And then TANF, again, we have a local name here as CalWorks. So just something to keep in mind, as these names may be unfamiliar for California foster youth, even if they are receiving them, given that we have different local names. Next slide. Once they have completed that section, the student will be prompted to enter the amount of their income tax and the number of exemptions that they entered in their tax return. Next slide. Now again, for a student who had filed their taxes and entered their income information, they will be given an option based off of how they answered those questions. They may be asked if they wish to skip the remaining questions about their income and assets. Now, if the system gives them that option, they can go ahead and select yes, and that will not penalize them or affect their financial aid in any way. Otherwise, the student would be answering questions about other types of income that they may have received. So for example, IRA earnings. So again, this type of information may be unlikely for your foster youth depending on what they reported as their earnings. And so they can skip this information and not have that negatively impact their financial aid status. Next slide. Now, there are also a set of questions that come up for students about asking for additional financial aid information. And here we want to highlight just a few things for foster youth to be aware of. So let's say you're working with a currently enrolled college student who is renewing their FAFSA. And last year, they actually received some earnings through a federal work-study job that they held on campus. So they would have reported those federal work-study earnings in that initial question about their total income. And they'll want to go ahead and report it again in the question that asks if they had any taxable earnings from need-based employment programs such as federal work-study and need-based employment. So this is the third question that you see here on your screen. The reason that they want to enter it again is that this will actually be subtracted when determining their total income. And this is what we mean when we say that federal work-study doesn't hurt a student. It doesn't count against them when they're seeking financial aid in a future year. Next slide. We also really want to clarify for foster youth that there are certain benefits that they may be receiving that they do not have to report as income earned from working or within the additional financial information section or the untaxed income section. So these could be extended foster care or AB-12 benefits that a youth may be receiving, including any SILP payments or payments from a THP Plus FC program. And this includes if that SILP payment is being sent directly to the youth. This, again, does not have to be reported as income. And then again, for students who are receiving the infant supplement, the same applies. We did also note 3 other types of benefits that foster youth might be receiving, such as CalWORKs payments, untaxed Social Security benefits, and SSI. These types of assistance do not need to be reported in either the income earned from working section, the additional financial information section, or in the untaxed income section. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So now, after they have submitted that information, a student will be asked if they want to skip answering additional questions about their assets. And again, here they can select yes and not have that penalize them. Now, some students who have income over a certain threshold, so if they have a high income reported, they would have to complete that information and report information about any savings or investment accounts that they might have. We do think that for most foster youth who qualify for independent status, that would likely not apply to them. So we are not going to walk through that part of the FAFSA for the sake of time on this web seminar. Next slide. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the other scenario. So a student who selected not going to file for their IRS income tax return. Next slide. So this might apply to a student if they did not work at all. Let's say in 2017, they did not work at all. Or if they did work, but maybe they only had a summer job or a part-time job where they did not earn enough money to be required by law to file taxes. So in our little tip box, you see here, well, what do we mean by earned enough money to file taxes? So this is a number that changes year to year. It's set by the federal government. So in 2017, if a student was single under the age of 65 and had a gross income that was less than $10,400, then they would not have been legally required to fill out a tax return. And again, gross income here just refers to the total income that they were paid before any taxes were taken out of their paycheck. So if your student had this scenario, they are not going to need to file a tax return. I do want to point out that students who are selecting this on their FAFSA that are saying not going to file are getting flagged in many cases to actually submit an IRS verification of non-filing. So we don't want to get into too much detail now, but just for you to know that in some cases a student who did not file because they either did not work or they did not earn enough money to work, they may end up getting flagged in the financial aid processing period to submit a non-filing letter. In that scenario, the student would need to again go to the IRS website to complete an IRS form 4506T and check box 7 so that they can receive a non-filing letter that they will then need to submit to their financial aid office. And it is a pretty complicated and cumbersome process. So if they were to be flagged for this type of verification, they would want to connect with their financial aid department quickly and make sure that they are completing that process quickly on their end, as it does take a little bit of time. Next slide. All right, so for the student who is not filing because they did not earn enough income or they did not have a job, they will still be asked to report how much they earned from working. So here they might enter $0 if they did not in fact work at all that year, or they might enter a number that's below the legal threshold. So maybe $10,000, maybe $5,000, whatever was their earnings from working. Next slide. And again, similar to the scenario we discussed before, if that student was working through federal Workstudy, they will have reported that as part of the earnings that they had for the year. And then they will want to also report it again in the additional financial information section so that it gets subtracted. So again, you see this third question on your screen, which asks them if they had a federal Workstudy job. So they would enter those earnings there. So perhaps they earned $5,000 in the year. $2,000 of that was from a federal Workstudy job. So they would want to enter $2,000 here so that that can be subtracted and not counted against them. Next slide. All right, and then again, similar, the student will be given the opportunity to enter additional income and additional financial information. And again, the same is true for a student in this scenario where if they are receiving extended foster care benefits such as SILT payments, the infant supplement, CalWorks, SSI, they will not need to report that information in any of these sections. Next. Now again, the student will be asked if they wish to skip questions about their assets, such as savings and investments, and they can go ahead and click yes and not worry about being penalized for skipping this section. Next. All right, and that brings us to option C, the third scenario for a student who was legally required to submit a tax return but did not already do so. So the will file FAFSA filer. Next section, next slide. So for this student who is going to select will file from the drop-down menu, they will see this message pop up on their screen. So they'll see a red kind of alert box appear, notifying them that they actually missed the deadline for the 2017 tax filing. And that's okay, they are going to still have to file their taxes, but the system is letting them know that they are overdue for filing the tax return. So just note that that will appear in red. The student will have the option then to select from the drop-down menu how they will be filing. So if they will be filing single, head of household, etc. And then they will go ahead and click OK and click Next. Now, when a student is going to complete this section as will file, they may be estimating some portions. They will need to go and actually complete the tax return and then come back to their FAFSA to update this information. So again, we just have this box here reminding you to remind the student that they will need to take care of that tax return and then come back to the FAFSA to update this information. Next slide. So again, similar for a previous filer, here the student would need to indicate what type of tax return they anticipate filing, and then they will be asked to enter their gross income. There is an income estimator here if they want to try to calculate out what their earnings may have been. And then they will hit next and be prompted to submit the same additional information sections. So that we are not redundant, we're not going to go through those slides again, but if you need to refer back to them, you can always download the slides after the presentation and refer back to slides 73 and 79 to walk through those same steps with a student who is a will file student. Next slide. All right, we are almost there, so let's move ahead and talk about how to sign electronically on your FAFSA and submit your FAFSA. So once a student has completed their financial information, again, we're operating under the assumption that this is an independent status student and they do not have to submit parent financial information. The student will be taken to the next section of the FAFSA, that is sign and submit. So here they will see a summary of all the information that they previously entered from all of the previous sections. They will have the opportunity to review this, and they can also print a copy for their records. And if everything looks okay, they can go ahead and click to the next page where they will be prompted to sign. Next slide. So again, here they will be told, just some general information, and then they have the statement down at the bottom where they are agreeing to the terms of the FAFSA, and then they can go ahead and click next. Next slide. From there, the student who, again, Jessica walks through the student who created the FSA ID, and they used an FSA ID to start their FAFSA application. So because the student took that time to complete the FSA ID and log in with the FSA ID, they will now see this nice simple button here that says sign this FAFSA. So the FSA ID does serve as an electronic signature. So the student can simply click this blue button, sign this FAFSA. Next slide. So once they have done that, congratulations, they have completed the FAFSA from start to finish. They will see this confirmation page show up, and they can print this for their records. They will also be getting an email confirmation. One thing we do want to know is that the student generally should see their estimated expected family contribution listed there, but it may take a few days or even a few weeks for them to receive the full student aid report or the student aid acknowledgement, and that will contain a lot more detail about what types of aid they are eligible for. Next slide. So after the FAFSA, of course, as Jessica alluded to when we first began, the financial aid process is actually a long process, and FAFSA is really kind of just the beginning. So let's walk through what are some things to keep in mind for after the FAFSA. So again, it will take a few days for your FAFSA to be processed. So the student should wait a few days before logging back into their portal. When they do log in, if they've given it enough time, they should see this message that their application has been processed successfully, or it might say that it's in progress. If a student realizes that they made a mistake on their FAFSA, let's say they printed out the copy of the preview and then later they noticed that they entered something incorrectly, perhaps they inverted two numbers, they can actually use the blue link that says Make FAFSA Corrections. That's highlighted on your screen in the second orange box. And then they will be prompted to, again, log in with their FSA ID, username and password, and then they'll be able to make some corrections. Similarly, if they're just trying to view and print their student aid report, they would select that link, and they will be asked to log in with their FSA ID in order to view and print the student aid report. Next slide. So just so that you can see what the student aid report generally looks like, we have a sample here. Again, it may take a few days, and in the busy season, it might even be a few weeks for that student aid report to be generated. The student aid report will, again, list their expected family contribution number and a few other pieces of information for the student. Next slide. All right, so again, we want to highlight that FAFSA, or the California DREAM Act, which closely mirrors the FAFSA questions, is really the first step. And we estimate that from start to finish, that's about 30 to 45 minutes for the student to complete. It's really critical that foster youth in California really go on to complete their Chafee grant application, which is super simple and short by comparison, and that they also take the time to create a Web Grants account. So let's move to the next slide and look at those steps. So for Chafee grant, Chafee Grant, again, has been recently expanded and can provide up to $5,000 per year for students. Importantly, students who foster youth in California can receive a Chafee Grant whether they have submitted a FAFSA or a California DREAM Act application. So it is open to undocumented students who are foster youth. So when they go to the Chafee website and begin their application, I do want to highlight that if you are an undocumented student, you'll see a question. The arrow is highlighting this question for us. And if you check that box, the system will prompt you to, instead of submitting the online application, to actually submit a paper form of the application. So again, undocumented students are eligible, but they will need to do the paper version of the form instead. Other things to note on the application, school of attendance refers to the college that the student plans to attend, and so the student should type in this information. If they plan to go to an out-of-state college, this is a college that may not actually appear on this California website, so they can contact the California Student Aid Commission in order to get that college listed. And then we do have another hotline here if a student needs assistance with their Chafee Grant. Next slide. So once a student submits their Chafee Grant application, whether they've done the online form on the CSAC website or have submitted their paper form, they want to make sure that they set up their Web Grants account, which is the portal that they will use to view any of their California grants, including the Cal Grant and the Chafee Grant. So on this page, a student can simply select Create an Account to begin. I should point out that two other important functions of Web Grants are to see if that GPA was in fact submitted by their high school. So again, their high school is supposed to submit their GPA verification, and by creating their Web Grants portal, a student can see if that information has already been received or if it is still missing. And then a student who needs to update any school information, change their address, or make corrections can also do that in the Web Grants portal. Next slide. So again, very important that a student is checking their email very frequently, checking their snail mail often, and monitoring any college or university financial aid or student portals so that they can be on the alert for any additional information or verification requests that might come from their financial aid officer. Again, 30% of students are likely to be flagged to provide verification of some type. So there is a pretty high probability that a student may get this type of request. And again, if they are not able to read that information and respond quickly, that could impact their aid. Next slide. So let's just move to and talk about some helpful resources on the next slide. I know this is a lot of information at once, and while you will certainly be able to come back to this webinar and to these slides, we want to point you in the direction of a few other tools that you have at your disposal. So the first is this great financial aid guide for California foster youth produced by John Burton Advocates for Youth. There are 3 different websites listed here where you can navigate to get to this site or this guide, which is available for free download as a PDF. Currently, it is available in English, but we also have a Spanish language version coming soon. So this is a really good tool to give to students directly, to give to caregivers and other adults who are working with youth. Next slide. And accompanying that financial aid guide, JBay has also posted on their websites a visual guide for completing the FAFSA, which, similar to today's presentation, contains screenshots of all of the questions on the FAFSA application and has some detailed instructions. Next slide. Now, if you are looking for in-person assistance with your financial aid application, I want to direct you to Cash for College, which is a statewide initiative through the California Student Aid Commission. And it really leverages a lot of partnerships between high schools, community colleges, and nonprofit organizations all up and down the state, where they coordinate free workshops where students can come in and get on a computer and actually work on their FAFSA or their Cal Dream Act or their Chafee grant application. I do want to point out that every workshop will have adults who are ready to talk about financial aid applications and who are generally familiar with those applications, but they may not have an individual who is an expert on all things foster youth. So we highly recommend that as a service provider that you accompany your youth or the youth and the caregiver so that they can have a little bit more individualized assistance. And if you go to that link down at the bottom of your screen, you can enter your zip code and do a search and locate a workshop near you. And these are running now through March 2nd. Next slide. And then, of course, we also have a few hotlines and phone numbers here where you can call in to get some live support. Whether you're working on FAFSA on the web, you need to contact the Department of Ed. If you're having challenges with the FSA ID, or if you just want to contact the Department of Ed Federal Student Aid Customer Service, we have that email listed for you as well. Next slide. All right, so now I'm going to transition it back to Jessica so that we can take your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Juana. We're now going to have our question and answer section, and we have a lot of great questions that came in, so we're going to do our best to answer them all in the next 14 minutes. And we have Mark on the line as well to assist us. Are you there, Mark?
Yes, I am.
All right, fantastic. Our first question that we have is, if a student changes their address on the Web Grants account, do they also need to change it on their FAFSA?
It's generally a good idea to make sure the schools get the address from both locations for on contacting the student. They generally will try first the FAFSA address, and if that's not successful, then they'll try the Web Grants address.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, if a student receives any scholarships, does that need to be reported as income on the FAFSA?
Okay. Scholarships come in two types, taxable and untaxed. If a scholarship is used for tuition and textbooks, it's tax-free. If it's used for living expenses like room and board, then it's taxable and will have been included in adjusted gross income on your federal income tax return. The FAFSA asks a question about taxable portion of scholarships so that it can subtract it out from the definition of income on the FAFSA. So it's generally a good idea that if you have a scholarship, the part of a scholarship that you pay taxes on, that you report that figure on the FAFSA.
Great, thank you so much. We have a few questions about the GPA submission process for Cal Grant. The first part, there's two parts to the question, is one, what does a student do if the school does not submit their GPA? And what should a student do, or do they need to do anything if more than one school submits a GPA?
Well, I'm not as familiar with the GPA forms for California, but my understanding is that there is a method that the student can use to submit the GPA themselves. If they have a copy of their transcript, they go to the CSAC website, and there is a form that they can use to submit it themselves. And this often happens when a student is a few years out from graduation from high school, that they may need to submit it themselves. And if they've been to college, they may also need to submit their college grades themselves.
That is my understanding as well. Thank you. One of the questions, and I can answer this, is about the Chafee grant in terms of eligibility. So one of the questions is if they need to be a full-time student to qualify for the Chafee grant. They actually only need to be a part-time student. And the other question was if they can qualify for both the Chafee grant and the Cal grant. And the answer to that is yes. And the third question about Chafee was if they need to reapply every year. So if the student receives the Chafee grant, they do not need to reapply. They'll be automatically renewed into the Chafee grant. But if they applied and did not receive it, they will need to reapply the next year. All right, so our next question for you, Mark, is what should a student do if, for example, they're being asked to report on their finances for 2017, and then their financial aid situation has drastically changed since that time? Perhaps there was a natural disaster or some other scenario and their income is no longer the same. What should they do?
Well, if there is anything that affects the family's ability to pay or student's ability to pay for college, so anything that changed from that prior year upon which the FAFSA is based, or anything that distinguishes you from the typical family, that could be high unreimbursed medical and dental expenses, for example, call the college and ask them about their process for a professional judgment review. This is a term that the colleges are familiar with. Sometimes it's called a special circumstances review or financial aid appeal. And they will tell you about their process. Some colleges just tell you to send them a letter. Some of them have a form on their website which you can download and print. And in the letter, you will these say a bulleted list.
Oh, I think you're cutting out there, Mark.
What?
Oh, you cut out there. Could you say that last part again?
Right. So writing the letter, you have a short summary of the special circumstances that affect your ability to pay. That can be a bulleted list with a few details about each of the special circumstances, and you should include copies, not originals, of any documentation relating to these special circumstances. So, for example, if you had a job loss or salary reduction, a copy of a recent pay stub or an unemployment benefits letter showing that you're receiving unemployment benefits, either of those can help. And the college will then review your special circumstances, make a decision about whether to make an adjustment for any or all of them, and then that will change data elements on the FAFSA form corresponding to those data elements. So reduction in income reduces the income on the FAFSA. It also will affect the taxes paid because it'll need to correspondingly get reduced. And that will then go through the financial aid formula to yield a new expected family contribution, which will then yield a new financial aid package. So aside from the subjectivity of does this justify an adjustment to the data elements on the FAFSA, the process is largely formulaic.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful. One question that we have is for a student completing the FSA ID, how quickly is that process?
To get the FSA ID, it's pretty quick. The FSA ID then goes through a comparison with the Social Security Administration's database, and that can take up to 3 days, but you can use the FSA ID to sign the FAFSA in the interim. You don't have to wait. But the FSA ID is, sometimes people, when they forget their username and password, they run into difficulty with it. Or if someone else creates the FSA ID for you, that can sometimes lead to problems. So it's a good idea to try to do it a few days ahead of time before you need it. Also, the password is only good for 18 months, so you may need to update the password once a year. I strongly recommend that if you have a mobile phone that can receive text messages, that you provide that telephone number when completing the FSA ID, because that'll make the process a lot easier. If you happen to try using the FSA ID, the wrong password 3 times in a row, it then gets locked. To recover and change that password, it's a lot easier if you have a cell phone entered into the system.
Great, thank you. One of the questions is, if a student is not going to be receiving their high school diploma, but they'll be receiving a GED or a certificate, will this affect the amount of aid that they can receive or be eligible for?
Okay, a GED is the equivalent of a high school diploma and currently counts as such on the FAFSA, so that should not affect eligibility for federal or state aid. A few years ago, there were other methods of qualifying, and there was a period when having and taken 6 credits in college counted and then didn't count, but the GED is sufficient.
Great, thank you. The next question, I can answer this. It was asking if a student was in foster care and is living with their relatives, such as grandparents, if they need to provide that financial information. So just to clarify the criteria on the FAFSA for independent status as it's related to foster youth, it's defined as if they were in care on or after their 13th birthday for at least 1 day. So if they can answer yes to that question, even if they're currently residing with a relative, they are considered independent on the FAFSA and do not have to report their parents or grandparents or other adults that they're living with their financial information, even if they've been adopted. So if they were in care for just 1 day, perhaps they got adopted at the age of 14, they still do not have to report their adopted parents' financial information on the FAFSA. All right. Lots of questions coming in. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all of them in the next few minutes, so just going to take a few more. One of the questions on here is, if they're constantly moving and they don't know which address to put, which address should they list? Do you have any recommendations on that?
I would recommend that they use an address that's going to be stable. So if they have a P.O. box and that P.O. box is not going to be changing, they're going to be keeping it, then they use it. Otherwise, call the college and ask the college what to do. In some cases, the college will allow them to list their address at the college. And this is most often when the student is living on campus permanently, not just during the school year, but also during the summer. But sometimes it can be care of the financial aid office, but you have to talk to the college to find out what they want you to do.
Great, thank you. One other question is if they're working with any youth that are on probation, if that negatively affects them filling out the FAFSA.
Okay, probation for drug use or probation for academic probation?
I'm going to assume they didn't specify, but for committing a crime.
Okay, so if they are on probation for committing a crime, but they are not incarcerated in a state or federal institution, it has no effect, other than if they were convicted of receipt or sale of illegal drugs while receiving federal student aid, their eligibility for federal student aid may be suspended for a period of time unless they take a drug rehabilitation program, in which case it's cut short that period. But that's only when you're receiving federal student aid and you are convicted of sale or possession of controlled substances. Great.
And is there any financial aid for foster youth that have not received a high school diploma or GED?
There aren't any large programs. What I suggest doing is searching one of the free scholarship databases, like the College Board has their Big Future website, and there's fastweb.com. They have questions that ask whether you are a foster youth, and they will ask other questions about your background, and they will match you against a database of scholarships for which you're eligible, and then you can apply for those scholarships. But these programs are very small and they have very narrow criteria.
Thank you. And just to add on that too, Mark's definitely correct that a lot of these big programs will not offer it if they don't have a high school diploma or GED. However, for the Chafee grant, students can still apply even if they have not received a GED or high school diploma. So we are actually out of time. I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to everybody's questions, but we really appreciate everyone joining today's webinar. Hope it was helpful in your work with foster youth. And we wish everyone the best of luck in filling out their FAFSA applications and hope to have everyone get in that application by the priority deadline of March 2nd. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Juana, as well, and hope everyone has a great day. And just as a reminder, this presentation is recorded, and we will send out the materials as a follow-up along with all of the PowerPoint slides. Thank you.